Welcome to the last of the three-part series of the Financial Empowerment Charla. I'm here again with Tanya, and this was a topic we've been wanting to talk about, is the mindset around money.
Yes.
It's such a taboo within our culture sometimes, or our society, but I definitely want to introduce you again. You are?
Tanya Menendez, co-founder and CEO of Snowball Wealth.
Awesome. I'm Natalie Torres Haddad, aka Financially Savvy Latina. And why don't we just get into that? What was it for you growing up at home, around your friends? What was that conversation you had for yourself about having the right money mindset?
Yeah, I've had a complicated relationship with money.
Haven't we all?
But I think I mentioned it in the very first episode, how I first started taking it really, really seriously in saving up for my emergency savings when I was planning to quit my job. And that was the first time I said to myself, I need to get into a wealth building mindset. I want to really feel confident in being able to make those decisions, have financial freedom, and feel like I'm not being held back by money. And so having that motivation for me was really big. What about for you? What was that turning point?
My turning point, it's always been a love and hate relationship sometimes with the money mindset, because growing up, we didn't have much money, you know, not only because we're first generation college grads too, that's another whole other story. But being an immigrant, being Latino, our culture is teaching us not to talk about discussing the challenges that comes around managing our money. So it's always something, kind of a place that is still difficult for me to kind of overcome that. But my confidence has definitely grown when it came to my money, since like the first paycheck that I got at 16 to where I am now, and understanding that there's different forms of ways of earning money too. But I think it's always been a challenging mindset that I had to kind of remind myself that some of those myths don't apply to me. Some of those old traditions are old traditions that shouldn't be passed down to me or to the future generation. So it's always been a challenge, but I think it's something that I'm learning to understand a little bit better. I am open more to more resources and open to other ideas, as opposed to it's not just one way of dealing with money, tackling debt, or how to really understand how I manage everything in my everyday life with money. So it's definitely been a love and hate relationship, and it depends when you ask me. But I think it's something that I feel fortunate enough to say that I've grown definitely in the last couple of decades, how much it's changed.
Same. And I'm glad you brought up that, you're first generation and you didn't grow up with much. I was the same exact way. I was never hungry, so I'm not going to say that, it was a very extreme situation, but I grew up working class.
Right.
And my parents always worked and taught me, how hard it is, what hard-earned money means.
Yes.
I saw that firsthand, that how hard they worked for their money. And so I always knew that it was important, but I didn't always know the specific steps that it took to create wealth. And so I think that for me, the turning point was first like getting control of my money and having enough confidence to say like, okay, I'm going to set a goal for myself and do 6 months of savings. But then a few years later, I took another shift where I got into the mindset of, how do I build generational wealth? How do I build that wealth that will help my children, my grandchildren, and that will have a safety net for generations to come, so that people in my family don't have to worry about money, and so they don't have to make those decisions of like going to school for 3 years instead of 4, or taking a job that maybe doesn't fulfill them over a job that does. And so for me, it was, how do I free myself first, and then after that, how do I free the future generations? And so that was a second shift for me. But that really came because I'm so grateful that I grew up working class, because I feel that I can now change the trajectory of my family, and I feel lucky that I can help, and that like hopefully my story will inspire, and your story will inspire other people that grew up in similar situations to start thinking about these other strategies.
Right. And sometimes it's not even so much thinking about the future, but who our immediate family is too. Because it's like, if we're doing well, that means we most likely can take care of our parents, especially our elderly parents, which is happening for many of us.
Exactly.
And understanding that we will have hopefully a nice windfall for our children and continue. But I think it's understanding that generational wealth does take time, but I also came back from a very similar background where both my parents worked really hard. And I think until college was a real turning point that not only did I know I had to continue to work hard, I really had to figure out, how do I also work smart?
Yes.
Because I think that's the correlation that a lot of, especially culturally, we tend to displace and say, we only have to work just as hard to earn this amount of money to make it. And being able to understand that you can diversify, you can figure out other ways to earn income, can really make it a lot more enjoyable, a lot more options, and in the end, a lot more money. So I think that's really key for understanding that it takes years to change that mindset. But when it does happen, it's a huge turning point for many of us.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about financial confidence.
Yeah.
So what are some ways that you've started to become more confident with your finances, or that you did when, in your journey? Yeah.
So the biggest tip I tell people is, especially when it comes to our confidence with our money, is just be realistic with yourself that you don't know everything. So when you start coming into a place where I can ask more questions.
Yes, I love that.
I can learn more. I can make more mistakes. I'd rather make more mistakes now than in the future with a lot more money. So kind of when people say, how early should we start? It's like the earlier you can start learning how to manage your money. And if you make a few mistakes, it's better to play with a few $1,000s than hundreds of $1,000s later, right?
Yes.
So I think that's something that's helped build my confidence, as well as understanding there's so many valuable resources out there. Not only free, like this podcast, right? But understanding that there is help out there in order to learn these terms, because I always say it's a different language. It's a foreign language when we're learning about financial literacy or anything to manage our money. So just taking that time, and it's day by day, you can just figure out how you can hone in on maybe 20 minutes out of your day to learn something new. This is something that you can continue to apply and add on to it. Because the confidence that we have, or the lack of confidence with our money, usually stems from our parents' traditions.
Absolutely.
Our parents, or even our grandparents, it goes even further back, whatever challenges they had or did not know what options were available to them. So when we start being a little bit more realistic and open to new possibilities, then we can start learning the difference of what's passive income, what's earned income, and what can help us go along that way.
Yeah. I love that mindset of you don't know everything, and you'll never know everything, right? So there's always something new to learn.
Yes.
And there's always new technology, new apps. So there's always going to be something new. Yeah. And if there's not something new, you can actually create something new. So if you're young and you're still in college and thinking about going into finance, you can actually create new financial products. And so there's always going to be something new. So no one knows everything. Right. And so I think that that's a big part of having that wealth building mindset. Is it's not just about building knowledge or building wealth in terms of money, it's about building knowledge. Right. And so just always be learning about these different strategies. And so we'll be sharing some of these resources on HispanicHeritage.org. Check it out. We'll be sharing some links and some graphics that will help you get into that mindset. Is there anything else that you want to share on the
I think learning? Sometimes when kind of going back to you were saying, when you were grateful to be around working class parents, right? Understanding to see what they had to do in order to trade in their time in order to get paid. I didn't really understand what it meant to have passive income until after college. I knew what it was. I've heard of it. And it was, for those that are listening or watching, it's kind of what is the difference between the passive and the earned income? And earned income is where we end up trading our time for what we came in for. So if you're working from 9 to 5, you're getting paid during that time, 9 to 5. Then the passive income is something that you most likely only created once, and then it starts to accumulate money every time it is seen, paid for, or worked on. And so usually that's arts of work, books, content, apps, things that you create, real estate that create that type of income. And for me, it was a turning point after college, understanding that those are two different types of income, which we I welcome all of it.
Yeah.
But in understanding that you can create those too. The only thing with passive income, it tends to take longer to create.
Yeah.
So once you have it, like my first book was that, I was like, it took me forever to write it, but after that, it was something that I never had to keep duplicating. It was done. And so that's what something that I think if we have these conversations of other ideas, how people can create that, I think that is a real opener. And figuring out that it only takes this small little amount to change the whole. I think we talked about this a little bit. My first place that I rented out, I remember getting a check profit was $50. And for me, like that was like, meaning I already had paid off my mortgage. I had a roommate that was helping me pay my mortgage. And actually she was saving money on her rent.
Yeah. Wait, so this is a property that you bought.
Yes.
And you started renting a room there. And then you started making some income from that room that you were renting.
Exactly. And it was this
I love that.
$50 profit, which people are like laughing like, that's not much. For me, at that time,
that's a lot.
It was a lot of money, especially right out of college.
Yeah.
But for me, it was not necessarily the amount. It was the fact that this worked. And so
you didn't have to work for it.
Yeah. And I'm like, okay, this is after everything had been paid off, the insurance and, the mortgage. And then those $50 with other properties grew to $500 to $1,000. And the fact that this is something that I get checks monthly that I don't have to work for, that was the most powerful mindset for me. So when someone says, I can't even imagine making this much money, I'm like, well, can you imagine making an extra $10 that you didn't necessarily have to work for? But you still have to create something. So it does take some time and effort. But I think that sometimes is that we look at something so huge that we can't attain it, but it needs to be, you know what, you start off small.
Yeah.
Right?
And I always look at it when I think of a goal like that of like, I was so inspired by your Instagram post on how you made 100,000 last month in income. And that was a combination of passive and earned income. So I was really inspired by that. And hopefully that also inspired a bunch of other people. But I think that that's a big part of wealth building too, is like having that vision for what your life could look like.
Yes.
And I think of it similar to when people tell you, when you even fantasize about like what your quinceañera will look like or what your wedding will look like one day, like you think through all the details, right? Like, oh, I'm going to have this band, or I'm going to have this many people, I'm going to have an open bar, this music. Like you think through all those details and you fantasize about it, or you think about it in that way.
Right.
That's a vision, right? You can have that same vision of like, I want to own a building. I want to own a block. And like, you know, like a city block. So like thinking about those types of ideas and having that vision, you naturally start to think about ways to get there.
Yeah. You just said it. It's kind of like building this map, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like, where's your starting point? And for me, that was key. Thank you for mentioning that. But it was so difficult for me to even post that. I remember
it's vulnerable.
It's being vulnerable. I didn't know how people were going to take it. But the only reason that really made me want to do it was, and it's all about who you surround yourself with, right? And I have a wonderful colleague and friend of mine who had just posted something similar. And I reached out to her saying, what was the effects that you had? And for her, she was like, representation matters, right? This is how we build our confidence. And sometimes I had to revert back and think, oh my gosh, that's exactly how I felt right out of college. I said, I can't wait to make 30,000 a year. I can't wait to make 50,000 a year. I can't wait to make six figures. And the fact that it's all about taking that little roadmap that says, I'm starting here, and how do I continue to grow? But thanks for sharing that, because it is being vulnerable. It's being difficult, and
not everyone has that transparency. So some people are doing this and they're not sharing how it's done or even what those numbers are. And so I'm really glad that you shared some of your story there too. And so that goes back to one of the like wealth building tips that I think is important, which is like knowing your budget. And like part of that is also knowing like your vices and like what you value.
Yes.
Right. So like, how did you start to budget to begin, buying your first home? And
so going back to values, what is your values? What are you influenced by? Right. So you and I have been talking about this even in the last two podcasts of like, where can we cut on some of these expenses, right? Knowing how much you're actually bringing in, and then really figuring out where not only can you cut, but how you can find different resources. So understanding that maybe you collaborate with other things or other people that can help you make more money. For me, budgeting was the very first step that allowed me to really think big and saying, okay, if I want to buy my first place, how much will I need for a down payment? How much will I need to fix it up? We're both in California too. So it's like, how much more money do we need in order to make sure all those costs are taken care of, those expenses at first? And then also setting myself up with the right teachers, the mentors, and educating myself along the way too on how to prepare myself to hopefully make less mistakes. Yeah. But it's just taking that initial step. If you go back to what are your values? Like, is it around experiences, or is it really something that's tangible? And for me, it was always like, I prefer the experiences, or I prefer the knowledge. Travel, exactly.
I want to know your vices. I need to know your vices, because you're talking a big game on how you're so you're responsible, but I need to know your vice.
People know this is takeout food. It's, we live in LA, so there's all these amazing food. So I think that's one of my vices where I'm like, if I can cut back on less of that takeout food, I have to be honest with that. And then I think some of it will be some with traveling too. There's something that I'm like, I could have cut back on that one trip and use that towards something else. So when we start to change our values, we're trying to figure out like, okay, this is something that I need to really project the next 5 years. I really need to, and that's what it was hard in my 20s to save money for my first down payment. I felt like I was crazy doing it, and my friends and colleagues didn't understand what I was doing that. But the best advice I was getting was do what you would do in your 20s to have a better 30s. Do in your 30s so you can have better 40s, and basically do what other people aren't doing. And so for me, it was like, I got to save, spend less on alcohol or spend out going out. So some of those values. So what did you have as far as vices, and what really helped you?
Yeah. And before that, I just want to recap like the big takeaways that I got from you, which was like, first being like a master of your budget and knowing what you value, what you don't value. And the second was building a team of like mentors, friends, people that will support you in achieving this goal. Yeah. I love that. For me, my vices. So I love health food. And so I will splurge on like a green juice, which is like irrational, right? Like I can do that at home, or I should just have a salad or something, but I will splurge on like green juice and like expensive workout classes and things like that.
So you're like,
I justify it. I'm like, oh, it's healthy. It's my health.
Right.
And like, but in reality, there's other things that are healthy.
But it goes back to your values. So it's kind of like, how do you cut out the luxury and the necessity, but still stay within your values, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I can do all of these things and probably spend less. And then it also goes to like, I also realize that when I feel like I've had a stressful day, I spend more. And so I already know that. Totally. So like, I'll be like, oh, I just really want a mani-pedi right now. And,
and I think that's kind of turns into the last part where it's like, our anxiety can really change our emotional and physical thought, right? And so it's that too. I'm like, I know when I've had a bad day, don't let me go to a store, because it's not retail therapy. It's not true. It's not good therapy.
It doesn't help you. No, it shouldn't even be called
more in debt. Yeah, I was like, it puts you more in debt. But yeah, it's that, how you just said, it's kind of that we know when something's wrong. And so I would tell people, I'm like, I can look at someone's closet, and if there's tons of tags on your clothes, you're trying to avoid something by purchasing something that's not needed or purposeful. So, trying to be a little bit more minimal, like the minimalist would be really helpful, but it's hard.
But that's one of the things that, when I started focusing more on wealth building, I really focused more on, I knew that I would spend more when I was stressed out. So what I started to do is come up with these strategies and a system for when I was stressed out of things that were like lower cost. So I'll go on a run, or I'll meditate, or I'll call a friend, things that still de-stress me, but also don't cost me money. Right?
Oh yeah, I'm all a big fan of potlucks, or let's go for a hike, because it won't cost you as much, for sure. The healthy tips.
And so going to anxiety, there's a lot of anxiety around money. Yeah. There's anxiety around debt, which we talked about in our last episode, but there's also anxiety around investing and like building wealth. And sometimes I feel like I go back to this phrase that my mom would always say, like, la costumbre es más fuerte que el amor.
So good. Translate that, please.
Right? And so it translates to your habits are sometimes stronger than what you need or want. Yep. Is like roughly the translation.
Yes.
And so that I think translates well into like your wealth building mindset. So sometimes you're just used to like living a certain lifestyle,
or you're
used to living paycheck to paycheck, and you're almost afraid to like start building wealth in a significant way. And that can sometimes be scary because you might not have a friend that owns a property, or like you might not have someone in your network that is starting to build wealth and start to invest. And so I think that that's like a mindset that is also helpful to get out of. So what are your thoughts on that? And did you feel that?
I love that, because it's now we're having that conversation. Yeah, I totally understood that. And I think for us, it's looking at, this is why we're doing this podcast, right? Yeah. Because it's important to be able to say, if I don't know someone directly, I'm sure maybe you know someone that can connect me, and I can actually see myself doing that, buying my first place or investing in the right tools, finding out what resources are available to us. Because I think this is a real fear that most of us have. So ideally, it's being able to understand that these resources are valued and needed.
Yeah.
And I feel like we can talk about this forever. So if you missed out on the other podcasts, make sure you tune into those, because I think these are really hot topics that somewhat a little bit overlap each other, but because these are conversations that we can talk about forever.
Yeah, thank you so much for tuning in to the Financial Empowerment Charla. This is the third of a 3-part series brought to you by Nationwide and the Hispanic Heritage Foundation. And as we said before, there's going to be a ton of resources and links and videos that we'll be sharing on HispanicHeritage.org.